at the end.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CMU and to Marpeck Commons. My name is Terry Schellenberg. I serve here at CMU as VP External, and on behalf of our students, our faculty, and our staff, we are really pleased that you have taken time on a Saturday morning for some conversation about various questions that are important to all of us. I want to begin by passing along regrets from Cheryl Pauls, CMU's president. She is presently traveling in Southern Ontario and awaiting the convocation address that she is to give tomorrow at Conrad Grebel University College. And I want to begin also by acknowledging and thanking Ron Jansen from Mennonite Central Committee, Manitoba, for his role in helping to shape this opportunity this morning. A conversation that has been framed under the title, the rubric, From Truth to Reconciliation. Our guest, as you all know, is the Right Honourable Joe Clark, the keynote speaker for tonight's 50th anniversary benefit concert for Mennonite Central Committee. And in spite of various mics that you see in front of us, the morning's conversation is to be intentionally informal, a request of Mr. Clark. In terms of process, following an introduction, I'm going to ask Mr. Clark to come forward to speak to us about some of his present work and concern. And then, as a means of getting the conversation started, we have asked three people to my left to each respond with a question or a comment. And then the time is ours to engage in ways that you have interest. Mr. Clark comes to us as a distinguished Canadian statesman, a scholar, and author, and I suspect for many of us needs little introduction. But should you not know, Mr. Clark remains both the youngest ever leader of a federal party, a major federal party, winning the leadership of the PC Party in 1976 at the age of 36, and the youngest person to become Prime Minister of Canada, taking office as Canada's 16th Prime Minister, a day before he turned 40 in June of 1979. During a lengthy political career, Mr. Clark was elected to the House of Commons 8 different times, serving twice as Leader of the Opposition, 7 years as Secretary of State for External Affairs, and also serving as Minister of Constitutional Affairs and Acting Minister of both National Defense and Justice. After retiring from politics in 1993, Mr. Clark was appointed UN Special Representative for Cyprus, following which he returned to lead Progressive Conservatives in 1998 and serving his final term in Parliament from 2000 to 2004. Among other things through these years, Mr. Clark played an instrumental role in the appointment of Stephen Lewis as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations and later as UN Special Envoy on the AIDS crisis. He shaped Canada's strong response to the Ethiopian famine, 1984. Mr. Clark led Canada's resolute stance against apartheid in the 1980s, Canada among the first G7 nations to do so, and supported economic sanctions against South Africa. Indeed, he served as chairman of the Commonwealth's Committee of Foreign Ministers on Southern Africa and was the first Western foreign minister to meet Nelson Mandela following his release from prison. Mr. Clark was instrumental in Canada's stand against the American intervention in Nicaragua and in supporting Canada's acceptance of refugees fleeing El Salvador and Guatemala. Throughout all of that, he maintained strong relationships with the U.S., helping steer the North American Free Trade Agreement negotiations towards a final agreement. Mr. Clark has been a visiting scholar, statesman in residence at numerous North American universities. He's the co-author of 2 books on Canada, Canada, A Nation Too Good to Lose, and How We Lead, Canada in a Century of Change. His commitment to consensus diplomacy has seen him lead international election and governance teams in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, as well as chair various global leadership and dialogue initiatives. Mr. Clark is also Honorary Chief Bald Eagle of Samson Cree First Nation, just south of Edmonton, and more recently served as honorary witness of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Together with 15 well-known Canadians, Mr. Clark has been very involved in Canadians for a New Partnership, resolving to build a new relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples of this country, based on principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and equality, and seeking to restore broken trust and a respect for Aboriginal and treaty rights, all with the goal of writing a new chapter in the evolution of Canada. Mr. Clark, we welcome you to CMU. I'm going to briefly introduce these three respondents, and then I'm going to ask Mr. Clark to come forward when we can acknowledge him being with us. To my immediate left, Wendy Craker. Wendy is a CMU instructor of Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies and co-director of the Canadian School of Peacebuilding. Wendy's a PhD candidate at the U of M's Morrow Center for Peace and Justice. She brings extensive international experience in the Philippines and Bolivia, Peru, with both MCC and Lutheran World Relief, and is a regular facilitator with both the Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute and the Northeast Asia Regional Peacebuilding Institute. To her left, Deanna Zantag. Deanna is from Southern Ontario. She graduated from CMU in 2013 with a BA in Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies, and she's presently working at a master's degree in our Graduate School of Theology and Ministry. For the past 5 years, Deanna has worked at Mishki Gogamang First Nation in Northern Ontario as Director of Summer Camping Program, and she now also works at Emergence, a program focused on Indigenous youth leadership and community development. And then at the far left, Vincent Solomon. Vincent serves as Aboriginal Neighbours Coordinator for Mennonite Central Committee, Manitoba. He is Cree from Norway House First Nation, serves as a priest with the Anglican Church of Canada. Before his work with Mennonite Central Committee, Vincent worked as a liaison and a cultural teacher for Winnipeg School Divisions. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Clark, we welcome you here and look forward to your words.
Thank you very much. Having heard the credentials of the people who have stools, I think I'll just quit right now and we'll listen to what they have learned and know. I want to start very briefly with a reference to Mr. Mandela, because it was an enormous privilege for me to not only have led that international work of the Commonwealth, but also when the first phase was over and Mr. Mandela was finally released from prison. There was an event 2 weeks after his release when he went out of South Africa to the neighboring country of Zambia, where members of the African National Congress, who had fought with him, and many of whom had been wounded and many of their colleagues had been killed, were waiting to meet their leader. They could not go to South Africa because they were banned, but he came to Zambia. It was a relatively small meeting, about 90 people. I was invited because I had chaired the Commonwealth Committee, and they acknowledged the work that the Commonwealth had done in this matter. Mr. Mandela gave a short speech to his colleagues, and then he asked for questions. And the first question that came was from a grizzled veteran of the African National Congress, who asked a question that was quite hostile towards the Afrikaans people who had imprisoned Mr. Mandela. And Nelson Mandela came back to the podium and very respectfully said, "I understand the sentiment of that question, but we of the ANC, have to understand how difficult all this is for the Afrikaans." And I thought, wow, what a demonstration of generosity on the part of someone who had just come out of prison, whose colleagues and allies had been killed and maimed. And it indicated what the world came to know as Mr. Mandela moved from imprisoned icon to a real and active leader of generosity in the world. What is interesting to me is that we all try in our lives to be as generous as we can towards others. I think most of you would not be here, we wouldn't be here, if that were not an important element of our life, and yet we're not always as good at it as we should be. And we sometimes think that, of course, we're not as good at it because the pressures upon us the other pressures are so heavy. Well, they were not as heavy as those that faced Mr. Mandela. None of us were in that Robben Islands prison as he was, and I think that there is a sense that what he can do, we can do. It's the kind of model in action that I think we want to bear in mind, and I was extremely privileged to have had the opportunity to be there. I'm going to make two quick references to a couple of the matters we had discussed before coming here, and let me say how very privileged I am to be with you. As I'm going to be indicating tonight, I am one Canadian who is not of the Mennonite faith, but who has had an opportunity to see Mennonites apply principles in action around the world. And I won't repeat the sterling speech I'm going to give tonight, but simply wanted to acknowledge that. Let me start, if I might, with Canadians for a New Partnership, which was brought together really at the behest of the former Premier of the Northwest Territories, the first Aboriginal Premier there, Stephen Kakfwi, who was growing increasingly worried about the situation in Canada where the bad news about Canadian Indigenous people is much better known than the good news, and where there are real problems that need to be faced. So he got in touch with me and with Ovied Mercredi and with Phil Fontaine and with Paul Martin and with Sheila Fraser and with Frank Iacobucci of the Supreme Court and various others, and asked us if we would come together to talk about whether there might be some role more Canadians could play in dealing with some of these issues. We did that in the closest possible cooperation with the three commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in a sense, we realized that the essential work that they had begun, which was to allow the truth to be told, was going to reach a point where there needed to be reconciliation carried out, and that they were not going to be as well equipped, they're not going to be funded anymore to carry that out. So perhaps others had to step forward. Just a moment, please. This is a springtime cold. It's not the simple emotion of the meeting, the opportunity to be meeting with you. We make it clear that we are a catalytic organization. We're not trying to replace what others are doing. We're trying to make what others are doing more effective and bring people together, and we're trying to increase the knowledge in the country of the issues at stake. Just a couple of quick points about Aboriginal people. One, we have to remember that in Canada, as distinct from in what became Canada, as distinct from in what became the United States, the other North American country, the welcoming to newcomers of Aboriginal people was extraordinary. Of course, there were some violent incidents, but nothing like what I grew up with, watching television and listening to cowboy and Indian movies. That was a U.S. story. The Canadian story, with some important distinctions, including here in Manitoba, the Riel Rebellion and all of that, the Canadian experience was much more welcoming and tolerant. They had their own set of beliefs when we came here, but they understood and respected our beliefs when we came. One might argue that they understood and respected our beliefs more than we understood and respected theirs. But nonetheless, the point is that not only that this was their land first, but more importantly, when we came to their land, they made us welcome. And that's a historic fact that is irrefutable and worth bearing in mind. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the things that went wrong in the intervening periods, because I think one can too often dwell too much on those bad things of the past. But there is one series of cases that is clearly on our mind, and that has to do with what happened in the schools. And I've been, odd to use the word privileged in this sense, I have been in the room when grandmothers who had been confined in residential schools and whose lives literally came apart, finally, for the first time in 50 or 60 years, found the courage and the place in which they could speak about the damage that had done to their lives. And I listened, and I said this, I do this with some shame, because I grew up in a town 4 miles, 5 miles from a residential school. I knew nothing about it. I went through my adult life. I went through my early days as a member of parliament, knowing nothing about what had happened to people my age from my part of the country in those schools. But among the things that happened is they were, and I ask you to consider what you would do if this happened to you. If when you were 4 or 5 years old, you had been taken away from your parents, you had been sent from a school, you had been told that the language you spoke was wrong and primitive, you were told to put aside your faith, and if you tried to speak your language, in some cases, blocks of wood were put in the mouths of 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds so you could not speak. And then there were undocumented and unknown cases of actual abuse. But the psychological abuse was far more serious than the actual physical abuse in very many of these cases. And this went on, and I can understand how there was not malice particularly involved here. It was much more ignorance than malice. It was ignorance and to some degree arrogance about our way and their way. But it was not necessarily malice. The importance is, and I learned this from the grandmothers, the importance is that if you learn abuse as an infant, you are more likely to practice abuse as an adult. And you are more likely to pass that abuse on to your children. And they then, having learned abuse from you, pass it on to their children. And one of the things that happens with people who are caught in this terrible string of events is that they became very guilty about it, but they also became very silent. They didn't tell anybody about their experiences. And if it is bad enough to have a bad experience, but it's even worse to have it eating like a cancer inside you for so long and not ever being able to talk to anybody about it. And what the TRC has done already, and it's extraordinary, it's revolutionary, is they have caused people to speak a truth that had been hidden before. And indeed, it's quite interesting to me that people with whom I've worked with over the years, including one of the commissioners, Willie Littlechild from Wetaskiwin, from Hobbema, really, Willie did not admit to anyone, to his wife, to anyone, that he had been abused in a residential school. He didn't do that until he'd been through 3 or 4 hearings, and the truth that he heard from the witnesses caused him to tell a truth himself, which was particularly important to him, because the burden of keeping that very critical secret from your most intimate relations and from your kids was intense. And that happened with other of the people with whom I worked in the Aboriginal community who had held that secret. So there is an intergenerational dimension to this issue that needs to be looked at. It is one of the contributing factors to the relatively low socioeconomic situation of Aboriginal people in the country, whether relating to susceptibility to disease or to lifestyle problems or to other kinds of things. And it is simply there. There's no redoing the past. There is taking account of the past and ensuring that it will not recur. Now, because that happened, there is this bad news image about Aboriginal people. Nobody knows about the 1,100 Aboriginal people and climbing who have earned PhDs in Canadian universities. Nobody knows about the Aboriginal students, the Métis leaders in particular. I met 2 months ago at the University of Manitoba in a series of roundtables. And here were a bunch of deans and former prime ministers and other people sitting around the table. And who was making the most sense? 23, 24-year-old Métis young women enrolled in the University of Manitoba. These are extraordinarily capable people, and there are so many more of them across the country. I'm from Ottawa. I'm living in Ottawa now, and my brother-in-law used to coach the Ottawa Senators. So I'm not a particular fan of Carey Price, who's the goaltender of the Canadiens. But Carey Price, you know, is of Aboriginal heritage. When he talked in the interview, which I've not seen, with Peter Mansbridge the other night, he talked about relation with the land. He talked about an experience that many of us from rural areas, particularly Aboriginal people, would know about going out and not being sure what was going on, but finding the calm of relation with nature to be reassuring to you. Anyway, these are, this is a situation of bad news and of good news. The bad news is known. The good news needs to be known. The good news needs to be built upon. On one level, that's a question of justice. That's a question of justice. But on another level, it is a question of our very real interest. One of the things that is happening in the country now is that the Aboriginal leaders have been going to court. They didn't want to go to court particularly. They would have preferred to negotiate. But they have been going to court, and when the courts have taken a look at their case, the courts have found, often unanimously, the most recent decision was unanimous, that they had very substantial rights. Those rights, court cases are about a specific case, set of situations and facts, but nonetheless, the rights that are determined, as they were in the Chilcotin case, 9-0, 8-0 at the time, decision by the Supreme Court a year ago, June of last year, it made it clear that tribes that had some, that moved around a little bit, but had traditionally been in a certain area, had rights over the land in their general area of occupation. They weren't absolute rights. If a province needed to build a highway, that could be done. But nonetheless, it made it very clear that it was not simply a question of talking to them. In order for things to happen, there had to be agreement by them. And that's a fundamental change in the power of Aboriginal communities, which is particularly important to a resource nation, which has to, if we're going to prosper, find ways to be able to move our products around the world. And the Aboriginals are not going to say, or not all of them, are not going to say, no, never. They are going to say, if there is going to be movement on these issues, on our lands, then we have a right to be part of the action. And that's been going on in Canada, in fact, for quite a while. I was involved at a distance in the Northwest Territories' original gas pipeline, which was stopped because when it was proposed back in the 1970s, nobody paid any attention to the Aboriginals. Well, the Aboriginals raised a ruckus and it was stopped. Now it has been approved. And it's been approved because Aboriginal companies are part of the coalitions that are building this forward. There have been an enormous amount of land settlements in the country, having to do with 40% of the whole territory of Canada, that mean that there will be agreement on these things. If we don't get that kind of agreement, we're not going to be able to do well economically as a country. We are not going to be able to do well morally as a country. That is an issue that we have to deal with. It took me longer to say all that than I wanted to, and I'm conscious of. Let me quickly get into the other theme that I raised in my book and that I think is really very important, and it has to do with Canada's role in the world. I don't mean simply Canada, the government, I mean Canadians, all of us, what we can do, how we can affect change in a troubled world. Two characteristics we have that are very important. First, we continue to be one of the most trusted nations in the world. A second related factor is that we have been able to maintain links between the developed world and the developing world. They're not perfect. I'm saying we're most trusted. I'm not saying we're always trusted or absolutely trusted. I'm saying that when conflicts arise, Canadian credentials are among the best in the world for resolving those kinds of conflicts. And we have, in effect, a foot in both worlds. Our only relation with colonialism is that we were a colony, and yet we sit in the G7 now again, with a group of nations that were either colonial powers themselves or imperial powers. We were not. We have those links. We have a population that comes from the whole world. We have a capacity to play a role internationally that many do not. That's historic. It needs to be renewed, but it's historic. The other thing that's happened is much newer, and that has been the impact of the internet on international affairs. And let me just quickly run through some of the things that has done. One, it has connected people who knew they were unhappy at home, who knew they did not like what was happening to them, but didn't know there were others like them. And suddenly they know, and that gives rise, for example, most dramatically, to the Arab Spring. But it's not confined to the Arab Spring. Why are people demonstrating in Hong Kong, of all places, with such courage? Why are there so many demonstrations of that kind around the world? It is because people who share some common concern suddenly know they are not alone, and they're able to be in touch. Secondly, this is a very dangerous factor. We know we've lived in a world of inequality for a long, long time. But one of the ways in which the consequences of that inequality were held down was that the people who were badly off knew nothing about the people who were better off. Well, with the internet age, if you are living in nothing at all, with nothing at all in somewhere in the developing world, and you happen sometime to be looking in a window and seeing a television set from someone else, what do you see? You see people like them, except they're driving big cars, they're living in wealthy houses, they're well. So the risk now is that as the developing world becomes more knowledgeable about what we have, the risk of envy, of anger, of outrage grows. That's a consequence, aggravated by the internet age. A third, and perhaps this is the most important thing that's happening, is that many of the institutions of the world, the institutions that made the world work, our churches, our banks, our governments, many of those are losing legitimacy rapidly. It's not all gone. In some places it is stronger than it was before. But there was a time when if a government said something, people would say, okay. Well, nobody would do that anymore in almost any government anywhere. There was a time when the capacity of the churches to lead all of their flock was unquestioned. That is no longer the case to the same degree. There was a time when the most admired institutions were the banks. That's not the case anymore. The point of all this is that these were sort of centers of order. They allowed us to go along achieving our own goals, living our own lives in a world that was relatively orderly because legitimacy flowed from these institutions. These institutions are now losing their legitimacy. Political parties used to have great legitimacy. Look at the elections going on in Europe right now. In Europe, the seat of our system. Look at the United Kingdom. Who knows who's going to win that election? It won't be a single party. And what is more dangerous is that the anger at the old parties is so intense that people have come together in very radical parties who will be hard to absorb once an election is over. So all of these forces in the past that used to hold societies together are fraying, and they are fraying everywhere. They are even fraying in regimes like China, which used to be able, with an iron grip, to keep things under control. In this era, because governments and businesses and others are losing legitimacy, the people who can often make a greater difference on the ground are people who are explicitly non-governmental. That is why the work of the Mennonite Central Committee, which has been effective in all eras, is more critical now than before. You have more access. You have more credibility. People regard your bona fides better than others do. It's a quite dramatic change in the world, and we have to all figure out some ways in which we can build partnerships between government agencies who do these things and non-government agencies that have a standing that we don't. I'm rushing through a long series of thoughts far too quickly. I hope they may have been some helpful. I now put some help to you. I now put myself before the gentle mercies of the people on the stools and look forward to an open discussion with you. I hope where I'm wrong you'll tell me, I hope if something I'm saying is unclear, you'll ask me, and I hope that we might be able to find some ways together in which we can not just talk about how good partnerships are, but try to identify ways in which we might build some new ones. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you for sharing these thoughts with us, Mr. Clark. I don't know that I am necessarily known for gentle mercies, but I'll see what I can do. I followed with great interest the announcement of CFNP, was excited and thought this is some sign of hope with the emergence of that collaboration. And I was also very glad to hear of your participation in that, given the kinds of roles that you have had as a statesperson for Canada and also your choices of activities to be involved with once you left public office. So pleased about that. Well, I guess one of I have many questions. You saw me writing a lot of notes. I guess I'll start with my question being around your choice of the name of Canadians for New Partnerships. All 4 words could be unpacked and deconstructed. Canadians, are you including us here? What was your intention around choosing that word? New, I think it's obvious from your comments that something new is required. And certainly as someone who teaches in peace building and conflict transformation, we acknowledge you can't go back to what was. There's not an easy kind of repair. We need to be moving forward to some kind of transformation. And then the word partnership. And having been someone who's worked with Mennonite Central Committee, Canadian Lutheran World Relief, NGOs who are trying to create partnerships, that's an uneasy word for us because who's defining those partnerships? Who's naming that it is a partnership? And given the members in your group, I'm not quite sure you've called it, I think you're trying to model a certain sensitivity to the word partnership, but I would be curious to hear a bit more from you what you folks are intending with the word partnership, given the history that you described, the very generous hospitality and the poor behavior from guests that you described as our historical and colonial legacy here. What can we hope for in terms of partnerships, and how do we get at that? How do we make it something authentic and meaningful so that we can say strongly, Canadians for New Partnership, and feel that that does bring us some hope? So that, I think, would be my basic
Well, thank you.
first question.
That's a very important question. Let me take you through the names, the words. Let me start backwards. We've had no trouble in our group with partnership, with the concept of partnership. There is a tension as to who will run it, who will have and the tension is strongest naturally among Aboriginal people. And for that reason, in our board, we are deliberately determining to have a majority of Indigenous members on the board. We naturally hope that the organization as it grows, the people who sign the declaration, just given population figures in the country, will be majority non-Indigenous, but nonetheless, we're conscious of that. And the word partnership, beyond that concern, particularly among younger Aboriginals, is broadly accepted. I think that is not a critical matter. New was deliberate because we accept the point that you make. There's not much disagreement among us as to what went wrong, how wrong things went since settlement. But there's a realism. Ovid Mercredi expressed it eloquently and courageously the other night at the University of Manitoba when he noted that particularly as Canada's population expands and diversifies, including many people who have no sense of connection with the atrocities that occurred to Canadian Indigenous people. It is going to be harder as their percentage of the whole population declines to insist that things can move back to what they were. So new is deliberate. It's obviously a new that is based upon accumulated rights, including, importantly, court enforced rights now. So that's not a problem. For, the little word for, that was no problem. The problem's Canadians. And the problem is, and please think about this, the problem is that there are a number of Indigenous people who are quite prepared to be. They're not always proud to be Canadians for reasons that one can understand if you're an Aboriginal. But they also believe that they have other identities. They are members of nations of their own. We had to deal with this in the ever-popular Charlottetown Accord, which I chaired and which you, among the majority of Canadians, rejected in a referendum. But they are members of nations of their own, and those are very important to them. And so we are discussing, please, I don't know how public this meeting is, but this is a discussion we're not publicizing at the moment. We are discussing whether it might be better to keep the initials and say Canada for a new partnership, because there is a general acceptance among Aboriginals and others that we are all part of Canada, and it is an easier word than simply Canadians. Frankly, that had never occurred to me. One of the things that I've learned in public life is some of the most important issues had never occurred to me until I heard from somebody else. Other than that, I think the question is, there are two questions. One is, are we going to try to bump others off the map? And on the contrary, we are very explicitly trying to be catalytic, trying to help others become more effective at what they're doing. The second is, what can we actually do? Well, and we're an organization without resources, except the prominence and intent of the people who are there. We now have charitable status, so we are working on fundraising, but it is tough in these times, and we're working primarily with volunteer staff, but we are trying to identify specific forward-moving things. One thing we're doing is try to draw attention to all of the good that is occurring, and there's a great deal of it, and trying to find some ways in which attention can be given to that. Some of us, people who have more resources or a particular focus, Paul Martin being prominent among them, are doing some really extraordinary work with the school system. But that's happening in his own right, not necessarily through CFNP. What the partnership has been doing is doing right now. We are following the lead. Get this, my province. We are following the lead of Alberta, which announced at the last national meeting of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that they were going to introduce, that they were on the way to introducing in the schools mandatory instruction from K to 12 of the residential school situation. We've spoken to the Premier of Manitoba, and to the Leader of the Opposition here, who are both disposed to do the same thing here. We've spoken to Premier Wynne of Ontario, who is inclined to do the same thing. We're talking to Quebec. It has already been done in the Northwest Territories and elsewhere. We believe that that's precisely the kind of issue where the groundwork has been done by others, but where the authority of a group like ours may be able to move it home. And we are looking at other issues. At University of Manitoba in January, I happened to be seated with the former Dean of Physics here, who came to the Aboriginal meeting. And he is particularly concerned about the relatively low level of Aboriginal students who are going into the hard sciences. There's been a very important increase in Aboriginal participation in post-secondary education, but it tends to exclude the hard sciences. And in this modern world, those hard sciences are going to be transforming. And there are some cultural reasons for that. He put me in touch with the Dean of Science at Simon Fraser University, she is now the chair of the Canadian Deans of Science, And we are going to sit down with them and determine what can be done. Again, this is not something we've started. It's something that's been started by other groups interested in these issues, but doesn't have the momentum that it needs. Those are the kinds of things that we hope to do. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Clark.
Hi.
I'd simply like to say that, first off, it's really refreshing for me to hear a politician speak who's done the hard work of listening to Aboriginal people in this country. So thank you for that. I wish we had a few more politicians that did that hard work as well. My question's kind of twofold. I'm grateful that you could address the structural violence that you see, that you hear in people's stories. And I see this with the youth that I work with all the time. And when I think about healing in Canada, I used to think about it on a linear sort of trajectory, like, oh, we did harm and now we're moving towards healing. But I have a Cree friend who's taught me to see it in a more circular way, where we look at all these harms as spreading out from a center that are still rippling. And so the youth I work with are still in the midst of that generational trauma that you were talking about. And so my question is this. You also talked about the fray that you see in structures of governance and order. And at the same time, with the recent Maclean's article, I was flabbergasted at the response of a former Department of Indian Affairs or Aboriginal Affairs leader who said that Canada doesn't have institutionalized racism. And I thought, how do we have a leader of a department like that who doesn't realize the depth of the institutionalized racism? And so I'm wondering if you see any hope in this fraying of institutions as also a means for a shift or for a leverage where this sort of fray could give way to other forms of order or different ways of instituting society.
The circular question is really interesting because it helps explain some of the health problems, including mental health problems in Aboriginal communities. There are other factors too, but this is those rates are unusually high. It's not genetic, it is experiential, and it builds upon, one instance builds upon another. And we don't have an answer to that at the moment. Well, there are people who've studied it more carefully than we have. In fact, it came up at an executive board conference call last week. What day is this? This week. And that's only the beginning of a discussion there. But that clearly is a matter that we have to deal with. It slides into the issue of stereotype. And the stereotypes are obviously critical among non-Aboriginal populations who, most Canadians have very little contact with Aboriginal people. They know of it as a problem, that's a Canadian problem because it happens here, but they've had no experience with it. And they do have stereotypes that are framed by the bad news. But the stereotypes are as important, I think, within the Aboriginal communities themselves. You've had much more experience in communities recently than I have, but as a young member of Parliament representing Aboriginal communities in West Alberta, I was struck, I was pretty young and sort of naive at the time, I was struck at what happened between ages, let's say, 13 and 16 to Aboriginal women. Because I'd go to the reserve and we'd have discussions, and the best questions, the smartest people, were always the young, the 12-year-old Aboriginal women. And then their lives came apart, and they came apart quite consistently. And that had to do with the sense of what their future was going to be. So the stereotype is there, and it has to be dealt with in both places, and that's a very hard thing to do. Part of the answer is to change public images so that the models of Aboriginal people are different at that, including, and this is the toughest area with young people. So that is, now, this might be, I might be accused of ducking an issue. There's no doubt that there is institutionalized racism in the country, no doubt in my mind. There's considerable doubt as to whether we will make maximum progress if we describe it as that. There are people whose attitudes objectively could be called racist, but they are quite generous on many other matters. To some degree, this has to do with growing up in a set of circumstances, growing up with the cascade of bad news. So how do we draw attention to the qualities of Aboriginal individuals and people as a group, Aboriginal people as a group? Here's an eccentric idea, but I think it's germane. One of the critical debates in Canada now is about sustainability, seen as the conflict between resource industries and environmentalists. Well, one of the realities is that Aboriginal people in their basic beliefs are the most environmental. There is a connection with the land that is absolutely essential to their identity and their history. Their involvement in the environmental movement now tends to be fueled more by protest than it is by their history of relation to the land. But their history of relation to the land can be very instructive to everyone if we are able to draw it out. And yet I think that the average Canadian view of Aboriginals involved in concern about pipelines is that here they are protesting again, rather than here they are respecting their traditional respect for the land. That's a little fuzzy still, but there's a very important distinction here that I think needs to be built onto. I think the getting out good news is very important about the racial instincts. And there are going to be some people whom we will never bring aboard this. So I think we have to find some way to, and I know you referred to it, to racism in a department, and I want to come to that. I think we have to find some ways to deal with the reality of racism in a way that does not drive away potential converts to a broader cause. On the department, I happen to know Bernard Valcourt. I served with him in cabinet. I was delighted when he became minister because I know him well. He has his faults, as everybody does. He's a generous person. He's an interested person. His experience is limited, like the rest of us. If he said the person who said that, I regret that.
He wasn't.
Yeah. And so I think that, and in fact, there have been one of the interesting characteristics about this government, which has not moved as much as I think it should have on Aboriginal issues, is that it's had some quite good ministers. Valcourt was good, Prentice was good, Strahl was good, and so it's systemic. And a lot of the deputy ministers are very good people. One of the most important members of the Canadians for a New Partnership is a man named Scott Serson, who was deputy minister of that department for 7 years, and whom I first met during the Charlottetown Accord because he was my advisor on Aboriginal matters. We started the consultations on the Charlottetown Accord. The very first meeting we held was with Aboriginal people in the north. Because, as Manitobans will recall, it was an Aboriginal vote that brought down the Meech Lake Accord, and they did it because they were excluded. And but anyway, the departmental the changes in mentality at the top are certainly important. They don't change an institution instantly, and I'm open to others' views on this. I'd be careful with the word racism in Canada. I understand its reality, but I think in terms of approaching a problem, we're better off trying to search for softer language, more congenial to the people whose minds we want to change. Did I answer your question? Good.
A little bit more a continuation on the whole issue of land that you spoke about. First of all, welcome to Treaty 1 territory.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here again. It's always an honor to be able to be amongst you and the work that you do. Thank you as well for the reconciliation efforts that you are making between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. A professor, I don't know if you met him, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, Takaiwe Alfred, talks about how there cannot be true reconciliation in Canada between Canada and consequently Canadians and Indigenous people unless the issue of land is resolved. Can you respond to that, or what do you think of that comment?
I think the issue of land is being resolved. Certainly, it is much more resolved than it was 20 years ago. In part, that is because the Supreme Court has become involved. And remember, the Supreme Court did not choose to become involved. They have to deal with issues that are raised. Raising issues, as anyone who knows the costs of court, are not easy, and it took a lot of perseverance on the part of people bringing the cases to get these through various courts and to the Supreme Court level. But there has been a consistency and a unanimity in the ruling of the Supreme Court on land cases. It's important that the language be read precisely, because legal decisions fit precise fact situations, but they also indicate a disposition with regard to other situations that are broadly similar. That is happening. The other thing that is happening, and I frankly had underestimated until I began to look at it, is the number of land agreements that have been made. They've been principally made in Newfoundland, Labrador, Northern Canada, but also elsewhere. This may be a slightly misleading figure, but it's a powerful figure. It is that they touch 40% of the land mass of Canada. And these are agreements that did not exist 21 years ago and exist now. They've been negotiated, and they're negotiated agreements. And they're not a negotiation like, they're a real negotiation. They're as objective as the courts. What's misleading about it is that it is by and large the unsettled population unpopulated portion of the country where these things are happening. But there's an unusually high percentage of Aboriginal residents in those lands, and for a resource country, which I think is could become the driving political issue, that's where a lot of the resource potential of the country is. So if it's clear, either by court or by land agreement, that there has to be a powerful voice, a determining voice by Aboriginal people in some of these decisions, that's a significant step forward. I don't know this professor, and I don't know the argument. I don't think anyone would suggest that we're going to have every issue closed on land. But I think that there has been some substantial movement forward. The question is to get others who have an interest in land to take account of that. Let's start with the resource companies. Their original behavior was awful, certainly in the Northwest Territories situation it was, but also I think that some of the people involved in some of the recent pipeline proposals simply forgot how pipeline agreements were reached 10 years ago. They were reached after the most extensive and genuine consultation with local Aboriginal communities. And I don't think that has been followed as consistently. So that has to be relearned. What is important is that there is a change in attitude among resource company leaders that arose first on environmental questions. An earlier generation of resource company leaders said there are no environmental issues. That's changed now materially, but it's also beginning to change, I think, on Aboriginal questions. There's a worry about tokenism, and that's a real worry. So I think land is central to this, but land agreements alone don't solve the whole problem. Land agreements alone can be a portal to a broader solution. The question here is about status and stereotype. And I don't mean status in the narrow Indian Act phrase. I mean status as equal Canadians.
Right.
As equal Canadians with a heritage that is different than that of others, but there are lots of Canadians with heritage different than others. So I think that's, I think on the land question we're making progress. I think we're going to continue to make progress because with the court decisions, there is no alternative. Their principles have been established, and as issues come before the courts in the future, the principles that have guided their recent decisions are going to stay in place. And that won't change with a change in the court. The court that decided this was majority appointed by the current government. And I don't think very many of them were appointed for reasons of their inherent interest in Aboriginal issues. They know the law, and their decisions have extended the reach of the law.
Thank you.
I want to thank Wendy, Deanna, Vincent for your questions to get us going. I'm going to ask that they sit down, and Mr. Clark, you can feel free to stand or take a chair if you'd like. This is now our conversation. There's a mic here in the middle. Please come forward with your question or comments. State your name. And I'm not going to moderate this. Please address your question to Mr. Clark. I will only come to the mic if you're going on ad nauseum, and my standing is your cue to get to the question. So please, this time is ours.
When I go on ad nauseum, please stand up. Please. Come on, the first one's always aha, good. Good for you.
I maybe shouldn't because I get to drive you back and forth to the hotel, and we've been talking there too. This is for the benefit of everyone. I've enjoyed reading your book, Mr. Clark, and indeed, reading the book and meeting you at McNally Robinson about a year ago led to today. So thank you so much for being here and for the work that has gone into that and for the reflections in it. One of the things that you talk about in the book is how our world is driven and creating divides out of our fears. You talk about that happening in people's personal lives. You talk about how that ratchets up between nation states. And you talk about how the attempts to control our fears creates its own spiral. And you have a very interesting analogy in your book. You compare the Air India incident in 1985 in Canada to 9/11 in the US many years later. What you observe about that incident is that the proportion of Canadians, the percentage of the population killed in the Air India disaster was actually higher than in 9/11. And yet the spiral of controlling our fears was very different in those years than has happened post 9/11. Would you care to comment a bit about that and where you see today's trajectories taking us and how we might speak into that?
Thank you. A conviction was never found in Air India, but there's no question that it was a terrorist act. But terrorism at that time was regarded as a more incidental development. And I think what happened with 9/11 was that it suddenly seemed to be a much more organized and prevalent factor in our lives. In fact, terrorism has existed for a long, long time. And terrorism really is not simply about finding a victim and killing that victim. It is about finding a victim whose death will cause fear among a larger community. Fear is more easily transmitted in this internet communications age. That is a simple fact of communication, but it's also a fact about what the media portray. It is far easier to, none of us will ever forget the images of the buildings in 9/11 coming down. The media regularly, this is not an accusation, it's just a simple fact. The media focuses upon the terrible things that happen rather than upon their solution when they occur. There is an instinct. We all have fears of some kind. And our fears most often are about things that seem to be absolutely beyond our control and random. And none of us, I think, who has seen people who went, but the young Canadian woman who worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs, who went shopping in a shopping center in Kenya and was bombed and killed, that could have been the daughter or the friend of any of us. And we're, on one level, we're aware of that. I think what is very important is for authorities of all kinds, government authorities, religious authorities, others, to put that in context. I'm going to refer tonight to what happened when I was a teenager in High River, and the Cold War was on, and there was actual talk in my little town about building bomb shelters that we'd all go down and get in when the and that was, we didn't build one there, but there were a lot that were built. I mean, I don't know, I never heard anybody asked, when do you come out of the bomb shelter in a case like that? But the point is, sort of, you were doing something to protect yourself against this kind of fear. People don't really know what to do now. And that's part of the reason that it is spreading. But here is what can be done. And that is to make it clear. Let's take a very specific case, and I want to be very careful with my language here, but I'll try to be. The Middle East, particularly with the so-called Islamic State, is obviously acting in the name, pretends to be acting in the name of one religion, of the religion of Islam. Yet these same forces, if you look at it, are deliberately destroying the institutions, the icons, the artistic record of Islam. And their premise is an absolute distortion of the beliefs of Islam. So they are not an Islamic movement, except that's what they call themselves. They're not true to the nature of the religion. But the fact that they call themselves an Islamic State, the fact that their actions are so brutal and are portrayed into our daily lives every day, causes too many of us to be too apprehensive about Canadian Muslims. I encountered this before in a very much more isolated situation. I was the lead Canadian minister in the first Gulf War, our first Gulf War, and with Saddam Hussein leading Iraq. And we were, the Prime Minister and I and others, were calling Saddam Hussein evil. And I was suddenly called by Arab Canadian friends of mine to come to Toronto to meet a group of Arab Canadians, and I did. It was a difficult meeting, but I learned an immense lesson. The first question was put to me by a Palestinian woman with a PhD, earned a PhD, who said to me, "Mr. Clark, have you any idea how many 6-year-olds in the Toronto school system are named Saddam Hussein?" And if you know anything about how self-referential children are, those kids, when they hear their prime minister or their foreign minister call Saddam Hussein evil, think you are talking about them. And that had never occurred to me. And we both, Mr. Mulroney and I, did our best to change our language, but the damage was done. This had a real impact upon lives. That was an unusual circumstance. It was an action we changed. We changed it deliberately, perhaps too late, but it had some. And but the risk now is that there is going to be an attitude towards Islamic Canadians or Islamic citizens of the rest of the world that does not judge them on their merits or on the merits of their faith. And we have to guard very strenuously against that. They have to speak out, and to their great credit, many of them are doing that. They're speaking out in mosques, they're speaking out elsewhere. But we have to, all of us, resist the temptation to assume that these terrorists act genuinely in the name of the whole they claim to represent. Because almost never do terrorists do that. Let me go back to Air India. After that bombing, we became concerned. We'd been concerned before, but it focused our concern upon potential radical groups in Canada. And there were two groups representing under 1% of the Canadian Sikh population who could legitimately be associated with some kind of terrorist activities. And we were able to deal with them more or less successfully. One of the things they would do is go to a premier of my province, for example, and make sure that at some picnic they had their picture taken with the premier. He didn't know who they were. I mean, politicians get their picture taken with people we don't know from Adam all the time. And yet they used that to establish their legitimacy in the country. But it was less than 1% of the Sikh population in the country. And we are all alarmed when we see stories of people from Canada who go over and become a member of the Islamic State. We pay no attention to the hundreds of thousands of people who don't. And they surely represent the majority. So we ought to be very careful when we deal with these things. And we have to be careful in what we say. And the other thing, to come to a point I should have made to you particularly, we have to encourage conversation with, quotes, the other, with people whom we think are not us, with people towards whom we might have some suspicion that we're a little ashamed to admit, but sit down and talk to them about who they are, what they think of these events, what we might do, how understanding might be built. I say because that capacity, that instinct to dialogue is at the heart, in my view, of what MCC does around the world and at home. And it is more important than ever. And it's important in our own ranks. I mean, I suspect that what happens now is that some people who were quite supportive of activities, for example, in the Middle East, are now becoming a little less supportive. This is not a time for MCC to draw back. Your drawing back does not affect the terrorists. Your drawing back affects the people whose reputation and whose life is being complicated by the terrorists.
My name is Stefan Epkoop. I'm also involved with MCC Manitoba as the board chair. And Mr. Clark, we had the opportunity to meet when I was in grade 2, which I think was likely more memorable for me than it was for you. But welcome to Winnipeg. My question is around the urban Aboriginal population, a rapidly growing population. I think it's about 60,000 here in Winnipeg, largest in the country. But unfortunately, it seems that divisions, even within an urban context, continue to exist. And my guess is that many non-Aboriginal people would have very little connection with their Aboriginal neighbors in their streets or their neighborhoods or the city at large. I'm wondering what kind of opportunities or challenges you see from the growing for reconciliation when we have large Aboriginal communities within cities.
Okay, thanks. The mayor of Edmonton tells me you're the second largest Aboriginal population in the country, but I won't get into that civic dispute. You certainly have a significant one. And there's a simple answer, and that is to try to stimulate conversations. That simply has to be done. People have to know more about Aboriginal people living in cities. Their problems are quite different in many cases from those of Aboriginal people living elsewhere. Now, when I say it's simple, nothing's simple, of course, but what could be done is to take a look in whatever community organizations you're part of and simply make sure that there are actual conversations. I don't mean lectures. I mean actual conversations where people sit down and talk about how are your kids doing in school? What's happening to them? How are your older kids doing getting a job? Those kinds of things. What are the kinds of problems you're facing? And I think one of the other things, a second phase after that happens, might be to see some kind of coalition building that might be developed. I want to elaborate on one kind of coalition building, and that is with new Canadians to the city who are not Aboriginal. Because I think that one of the issues that is looming on the Aboriginal issue is that most of us whose families have been here for 4 or 5 generations have some sense, when we think about it, we have some sense of responsibility for what happened in the Aboriginal schools because we just weren't paying attention. If you've come recently from Mumbai and are settled here, first of all, you've probably faced and your family has similar atrocities at home. But secondly, this is a part of your new country that you hadn't really paid much attention to, you don't know much about. You might have a greater innate sympathy if you knew more about it, but the opportunities for you to cross paths with someone who is Canadian Indigenous background are probably fairly limited. So it might be worthwhile if one is looking at stimulating dialogues and conversations to put a particular focus on newer Canadians who have migrated here, whose families have come here in the last 10, 15, 20 years. I've not expressed this at CFNP, but I'm worried about that dimension of things on a national level because when we look at the problems we have now, most cases, if I go back to the absolutely unrepresentative community of High River, because it was a very unusual place when I was growing up, they're a pretty limited place, a wonderful place, but limited in its composition. We all had some responsibility for the Glenbow School that was out there, the Benbow School that was out there that we had paid no attention to. That isn't the case for the person who's moved to High River from Lagos in the last little while. So I think this question of reaching, but I think that don't underestimate the importance of, let me come back to conversations, by the way. One of the things I argue in my book, and I go on from it, is that if one looks at the history of Canada, our greatest accomplishments as a country have been the result of conversations with one another. Very often they were formalized conversations in the form of royal commissions. But if you look at the signal accomplishments of Canada, the things we've done, many of them started as royal commission recommendations. That's how we got health care. That's how we got the equalization formula. That's how we got the decision to establish national cultural institutions like the Canada Council. That's how we got the free trade agreement. All of those things were preceded by a genuine, serious inquiry that involved conversations with Canadians. I remember I was an undergraduate at U of A. I grew up we had francophones in High River, but I didn't know they spoke French. I went to a Royal Commission hearing in Edmonton in the McDonald Hotel, sat at the back on bilingualism and biculturalism. And I learned an immense amount sitting back there. I didn't take part in that conversation, but I was sure affected by it, and it came to me. And I think there has been a Canadian practice of conversations that has fallen aside. We haven't had a Royal Commission on anything for 10 years, since a one-person commission by Roy Romano. And I think we have to get back to that practice, because what they do is cause us to meet people, our fellow citizens whom we would not otherwise have met. And on the Winnipeg level, there are all sorts of people of the kind you're discussing whom you haven't met, you don't know enough about, and they don't know enough about you. And the best way to build down those barriers is to talk about them. I'm sorry, maybe not talk about them, get to know one another. And if the question of barriers comes up, deal with it then.
John Lorenz.
Yes.
Does 60% mean anything to you in retrospect? When you became Prime Minister, I think you made a decision that you needed to have 60% support for something, and I believe you got 58.
No, your figures are a little out, and I remember them fairly precisely.
Okay. Could you comment on that experience? We've been talking about some fairly deep issues, but this is something that's kind of personal for you, and I'd like you just to comment on the decision that you made at that time.
First of all, let me say that about 8 weeks after that decision, I guess 3 months after that decision, I was at a reception at Government House when Prince Charles came by, and it was a receiving line. I was in my fancy tux, and he was in his fancy tux, and I said, "Welcome to Canada, Your Highness," and he said, "Why isn't 65% enough?" And that was a good question. The answer is, at that time, I was leading a very unruly party. We were the minority party in the country. We had a federal election coming. I was concerned that if I didn't have my whole party together, I would be less effective in a campaign, and so I thought I needed a strong mandate. I want to be careful how I say this, too. I have learned things since about the composition of the delegates that I did not know then. And it's clear, and I think had I known that then, I probably would have taken a different decision.
We have time for 2 more questions, so feel free.
Thank you for speaking. And I just want to return to the question of indigeneity and new Canadians.
And
I
which?
guess. Yeah, Indigenous people and
New
new
Canadians.
Canadians. I've been thinking a lot about this because my partner, who is in Ottawa, where I live, I'm just here visiting, her parents are from southern China, and they were Indigenous. They had no cultural memory of having been anywhere else, like generations back until they don't know. And that, among other things, has led my partner to become really interested in the question of indigeneity. And that's actually not something that's, I think in a way it's not been talked about today a lot, is what does that idea, the indigeneity mean? That kind of, that sense, partly I think it's understood as that basic thing of not having a cultural memory of having been anywhere else. So this is the place. And it strikes me that a lot of people who move to Canada move from a condition of indigeneity. And in recent waves of immigration often have moved under threat or economic desperation from a condition of indigeneity. That certainly was true of my partner's parents, who were chased off of their land, basically. They had been farmers. And I'm wondering whether you think there might be any potential in that growing conversation and bringing new Canadians into the conversation in that idea of indigeneity and relating that back to that experience that so many of them would have left.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Two comments quickly. One, a lot of people who come here, including refugees, one of their very most important priorities is to figure out what this country is about and how they can be part of it. They're not transitory, and they want to be part of it. They know they're not indigenous in your sense, but they are part of a new community, and they want to be part of it. So that opens a great opportunity for them to understand that part of our community is that there has been this Canadian indigenous tradition that has specific values and a specific history and all of that kind of thing. There's not a natural hostility to it, and that's part of the point you're making. There is a sense of the value of that sense of identity, but there's not much knowledge of it. And we try to teach them other things. We teach them about the tax system and about other things. We don't teach them about the important things, which has to do with the nature of the country. And maybe that's part of what is important in some of the conversations that might be engendered in neighborhoods around here. But the other question, the other factor that you raised that is quite important, and I hadn't thought of before, is that they may well, having chosen to leave an environment that was indigenous but unacceptable to them, they may well have a better inherent understanding of the importance of collective memory, of indigenous imprint than other Canadians. And that's a very interesting basis for, first of all, some inquiry and then some discussion. I think that if anything's been written on this, I'd like to have it. I don't know that it has, but I think that's a very interesting opportunity. I learned something, it happened that during a time when I was foreign minister and had a great big building with a great big auditorium, the president of Canadians for French was a constituent of mine. And Canadians for French were having a national meeting in Ottawa, and so I offered a reception for Canadians for French and my constituent in the Pearson building. There might be some rule prohibiting that now, but there wasn't at the time. What struck me was that a very high proportion of the parents for French who came to that meeting were people who had been born abroad. First of all, my original thought was, this is because they have some experience in learning second languages. But the other was that when they came to Canada from wherever it was, including China in a couple of cases, they said, well, part of the nature of this country is that it's officially bilingual. My kids are at an age now where they can learn anything more easily than they will later, so let's enroll them. And I think that my association with the work in Calgary, where I was MP for my last 4 years in Parliament, is that, and that I had the chance of working with the Canadian Catholic Immigration Services there. And I learned an immense amount about the period of immediate settlement of newcomers and what are on people's minds. And a good part of it is to make sure their kids are okay. That's a big part of it. But another part of it is to figure out, what have we joined? Who are we now? What's our new identity? And that's less intangible than it sounds. We can get at that. Just a Canadian word on the Calgary Catholic Immigration Services in Calgary. I was invited there because my sister-in-law, who was an accountant, or as a banker, was the secretary of the Calgary Catholic Immigration Services, voluntary organization. She is also a Korean, and she is a very active member of a Protestant church but nonetheless, she was, and the head of the Calgary Catholic Immigration Services was was a refugee from Iran who had been forced out of Iran because he was in charge of teaching their most senior Naval Academy courses until the regime found out that his daughter, when she went to school at age 6 and had to identify her religion, identified it as Baha'i. And they assumed if the 6-year-old's Baha'i, the guy teaching our admirals must be Baha'i, and he had to escape the country. So you had the Calgary Catholic Immigration Service with a Korean Protestant as their secretary and an Iranian Baha'i as their director general. I've always thought that's a wonderful Canadian story, but it also taught me a lot about Calgary. One last. I like your shirt.
Thank you. My name's Rebecca, and I'm a history student here. And lately in the news has been that the University of Winnipeg is going to start requiring that students take Indigenous studies, at least one course. And I know a lot of people are for that, but people are also saying that it goes against, the students' right to choose and could have people start thinking even more negatively about Indigenous people, the fact that they're now being forced to learn about that. Do you see what benefits or challenges this requirement's going to cause?
This is an institutional question which I maybe shouldn't intrude on, but I think there's a great value in learning more about Canada's Indigenous culture, particularly for young people. I think the ideal method would be for them to choose to do it themselves, but if they don't, I think that they could find a lot worse uses of the time that they would be spending in those courses. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Clark, for your insights and commitments, for the frankness and openness of your comments, and perhaps as much as anything, for modeling the neighborliness, the conversational style that you spoke about for us here this morning. We are really grateful. Thanks for your presence. Please join me again in thanking Mr. Clark for his conversation. Thanks again, Ron, for your part in shaping this morning. And thank you all for coming. Enjoy your day, a lovely spring day. Thank you.